And it is my belief that they will any moment reject this mood in favor of a period of restrained grief and sober private mourning. That's the way we do things in this country. Quietly, with dignity.
Hello and welcome once again to the Cine-Files, where this week we continue our exploration of Stephen Frears' The Queen. My name is Steve Morris. I'm a filmmaker and directing instructor in Los Angeles, California.
Hello, everyone. My name is John Rogue. I'm a writer, producer, and host here in San Diego, California. And let's get it on. Let's go back and visit the Queen.
And I am thrilled to welcome back to our microphones a senior writer at the National Review, author of the Conservatarian Manifesto, and host of his self-named podcast, Charles CW Cooke. Welcome back to the Cine-Files.
Thanks for having me on again.
Well, we started with you. It would seem really awkward if you had disappeared.
You never know. You never know. I could have done something so egregious that you had no choice but to push me out the parachute chute.
Well, there's still time. I'm sure you could work up for it if you really wanted to. So where we left off, there had been a huge transition in which the royal family had finally reluctantly agreed to having Diana's public funeral. And after that scene, we return to Tony Blair's office, where he gets a call from the Prince of Wales's secretary. And this is Stephen Lamport, who's played by Tim McMillan. And this scene is really weird.
The Prince of Wales has asked me to thank you again for your kind words yesterday.
Not at all.
It almost feels like they're talking in code.
The Prince feels that you and he are both modern men of similar mind who could work well together at this difficult time.
What does that mean?
Well, I mean, first of all, seeing Charles watch this conversation happening lets you know, like, this is how it's done in the halls of power. You use someone that can take the fall for you to make the kind of implication here. And the implication is, well, the Queen is old and she's out of touch and I need to look good here. So, we're modern men. We can deal with the reality as people would like it to be nowadays, or now at the time nowadays. So we can be in alliance on this against the Queen. So it's his way of, yet again, here's where the Charles turn starts to happen, of him worrying about saving his ass more than it is about caring about Diana, in my opinion, from what the film has given me.
What I think is so interesting is, I think largely this is a film not with Tony Blair, but with the royals, of trying to figure out what they're thinking with the smallest number of clues. And what I find interesting about that setup is that's pretty much reality of the monarchy in general. You don't, everything is this show that you don't get to see behind.
Well, please thank His Highness and assure him he can count on my full support at all times. Was that it?
Yes.
And that is the end of the call. And I love the look over from his secretary to Charles after the call of just like, okay, did that work?
Charles, I'm sure you've encountered this possibly in your reporting. You go through mediaries to kind of encounter buffers or whatever between you and important people, or is that something that's foreign in this kind of situation?
Well, I think it's probably more Byzantine when it comes to the royal family. I read the scene as Charles trying to feel out whether Tony Blair was Tony Blair or Cherie Blair.
Oh, interesting.
Because, of course, if it got through to Cherie Blair, if she'd been the prime minister,
yeah,
the notion that she would be, well, she wouldn't be a modern man, but she'd be a modern woman would have been correct.
Yeah.
But with Blair, of course, he's not entirely, is he? And we see this later. He's much less modern than he likes to portray himself, and certainly I think than his wife would like him to be. And I saw a certain discomfort on his face at the whole thing because he feels caught in the middle.
Yeah, that's what I see too. And I think there's I don't know if you've I'm the oldest person here. I don't know if you two have had the experience of trying to relate to people that are younger, hipper, and cooler than you, and you're trying to like pull off sort of, no, I'm cool. I'm cool with the like it feels like Charles is trying to hint like, no, I'm on your team, right? I'm not one of them. Don't judge me with one of them.
I think that's exactly right.
Seeking an ally, yeah.
Yeah, and then he hangs up the phone, and Tony asks his staff, like, what is this all about? And the interesting thing that comes out of this scene is one of them says that he's actually terrified of being shot, that he's been asking for extra protection. And apparently there are a bunch of sources on this. This really was true. At this time, Charles was worried about being assassinated.
That's such a weird thing to be. Like, a monarch hasn't been assassinated in how long? But why did Charles feel that? What was the obsession with that? I'd love to know. You know, where does that idea germinate from?
Look, I know far less about these times than either of you, but I will say, and again, to avoid getting political in any way, there are a whole bunch of people today who are getting death threats all over the place. And I don't know if that was going on then, or if people were coming on the news and saying things like that. But
yeah,
you know, people are crazy.
That's true. That's true.
And I do like they say.
Well, he probably thinks that if he's seen to be on our side, then that'll leave the Queen in the firing line.
What, so it's okay for his mother to take the bullet, not him? What a family.
That's the point. Yeah, it feels like he is throwing her under the bus. It seems to be the insinuation in my mind that he's throwing her under the bus.
We're back at Balmoral, and the Queen is out walking her dogs, which are black labs. I guess the corgis are more often at Buckingham Palace, and the labs are at Balmoral or something. And asks where the stalking is going on, and Charles comes to join her, and they drive off in her Range Rover. And for the first thing is just seeing the Queen driving is weird for me.
I thought you were going to get a new one of these.
What for? It's perfectly all right.
And that is such a Depression era, World War II, you know, because in my mind, the royals move around in the lap of luxury at all times. Mm. And that she's driving this, you know, older Range Rover and going, no, it's fine. It'll last. That's what my dad would say, you know?
Yeah, but it's also symbolic, right? This idea of wanting to stay with the same mentality, this has always saw us through. This has been here a long time. Why change now? And I feel like there's a lot of symbolism that's going to be happening in this conversation, because even within this conversation in the car, there's a lot of things that are not being said, but being said by the things that are alluded to in the conversation. But her coming off saying, like, you know, this is blasting me. Why should I change? Why? And so I think it's more about sticking to the way that it's always been rather than changing. Yeah.
But that is a central theme to the whole film.
Yeah.
And I agree with you, John. I think this scene in this car is fascinating.
Yeah.
There's so much going on here. And it begins with Charles talking about what Diana would have done if he had died.
She would certainly have taken the boys to Paris. I rather regret not doing that now.
Wouldn't expose them to the media. No, but that would have been a dreadful thing to do. No, they're much better off here. It's private. They're protected.
So the Queen knows what the right thing to do is, you know?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you've ever dealt with people that are absolutely certain that they know. And I don't know if any of them have been your parents or people in your family, but I have. And then the next beat is so fascinating because it starts off with him just complimenting Diana.
Whatever else you may have thought of Diana, she was a wonderful mother. She adored those boys and never let them forget it. Always warm and physical, never afraid to show her feelings.
Why is he saying this to his mom?
I think it's a shot at her, at how he was raised by her. And I also think he's drawing battle lines here early in the situation by changing the tactic, which the Queen will bring up later in the conversation with her mother, right? This Charles was all of a sudden changing his tune about Diana. And, this is the kind of gaslighting that people do once political people do in a situation, to kind of change the perception of how they've been talking about a certain subject for a long time. Be like, well, no, I always thought she was a good mother. If nothing else, and it's like, what are you talking about? You did nothing but talk crap about her and cheat on her and do all this kind of stuff. And now all of a sudden you want me to see her in a certain way. And the way he puts it on the table towards her, like, well, whatever you think about her, she was this. And it's like, wait a minute. We both have commiserated about our distaste for Diana. And so in a way, it's kind of that's a dirty tactic that he's pulling on his own mother, and then also throwing in what I sense is his, or what the film is telling us or showing us is his how can I call it? Well hit, well, not well hit, years long anger at how he was raised by his mom, and maybe the blame he wants to throw at his mom instead of himself for how he turned out and how this all went down with Diana. I don't know.
What do you think, Charlie? What do you see in this scene?
I found it excruciating because it felt to me like an extended, indirect criticism of his own mother.
Yes.
And then she gets out the car.
Yeah, because
she thought that too.
Yeah. It's so funny too, because I think the other element, and I don't know if you've experienced this, but I have, which is, you're supposed to say the nice stuff about somebody after they died. But there was a particular one situation in my life that I could think of where there was a person who was exceptionally difficult, and we all agreed that this person was exceptionally difficult. And then after this person died, there was one person that said, "Wasn't that the most wonderful person you ever?" I mean, they're just perfect in every way. It's like, we were just talking about this. And what I connected to also is the scene where he's outside the room with the boys and they're discussing, where she finally agrees that to have the private plane fly him to Paris. And there's that moment where she almost reaches out, or seems like she's about to reach out to comfort him on some level, and then doesn't. And that, warm, physical, never afraid to show her feelings line is like, oh, it's rough. And her response to it is,
especially whenever a photographer was in sight,
because that's how she sees it.
Well, and this is the truth of Elizabeth, right? She, and we do the accolades, and of course she deserves all of them. She was a politically shrewd person. Like, she understood how to play these moments, and even in micro and macro ways. And I think the film, this is the conversation where the film, which has shown you an insensitive queen, possibly a queen that isn't reading the tea leaves or understanding what her people want. This is where that starts to turn, where you start to humanize her a little bit more. You start to see the things that she's been dealing with in her life, and see how she has had to encounter all this stuff, and how she's slowly turning away from it. So it's a genius move by the screenwriter to make this move right here at this time, to start the turn. Just when it gets to the point where there's no turning back with how much you might hate her, this is where we start to see the human side of it, and the vulnerability, and seeing more levels to her character, so that we have to think about, well, how do we process this, and how do we see her processing it through this new prism?
I think that the slow turn this film makes on her is really beautifully done. And one of the moments is he says,
that was always the extraordinary thing about her weaknesses and transgressions only made the public love her more. Ours only make them hate us. Why is that? Why do they hate us so much?
Not us, dear.
What?
What just happened?
Beautiful shade. That's what.
Well, what is she? Can you explain what she is saying here?
I don't want to speak for the Brit in the room, but I imagine what is going on here is that she's very well aware that it isn't her that usually gets the guff, and she realizes over the last few years, or she's essentially saying with that one line, the last few years, it's been Charles who's been getting raked over the coals by the press. It's been Charles who's had that audio tape released of the things he was saying for Camilla and wanting to sleep with her and be in her pants or be her pants, all these things. So all of this stuff had come out, and Charles had been turned into the villain. And her mother, his mother probably didn't like it. It's her son. But then again, this is thing of political preservation. And so in that moment, what she's saying to him straight up is that it's not us that they hate, it's you, because of all the shit that's gone down around Diana. I've managed to stay a little bit Teflon Don in this situation, but you have taken the hit. So it's not me that they hate, it's you. Don't bring me into your shit. That's your shit, is what I think she's essentially saying.
But it's also tense because for the first time in a long time, it's not true.
Yeah, exactly.
She's crossed with her entire family by this point in British history because they keep dragging her down.
Yes, good point.
She's astonished to see what has happened to the extended royal family with Charles and Diana, with Andrew and Fergie. And she's right. It's a waspish line. But she's not right in that moment for the first time because people are cross with her.
Right.
And that's why I think this is just such a great scene, is that it's all without any untoward emotion. We had him changing his tune on Diana, him saying you weren't a good mother, her saying, why do they hate us? Her saying, no, dude, they hate you, and her being wrong about what's going on. That's a lot to happen in this little scene. And then I love that she just goes, I don't feel like stalking. I'm going to walk home. Bye. And then after a helicopter shot over the mountains as we see them, out stalking, we cut to this interview, which I didn't, as not a person who really followed the royals closely, I didn't know that much about this interview, which took place with Diana on November 23rd, 1995.
Yeah.
Were you familiar with this?
Is this the one with, was it, oh God, who's the reporter? He recently got in trouble for this entire interview. If I think it's the one you're referencing, where she talks about what it was like being in that marriage.
Martin Bashir.
Yeah, Bashir. Martin, but that's it. Bashir. Yeah, I didn't want to. But he recently got in trouble for this interview, and I think the BBC got in trouble too because they had kind of manipulated the interview in a certain way, and so how they got. And Charles, you probably have more information on this than I do, but he got in trouble for this interview. But this interview was explosive. This was the interview that really kind of showed and exposed what was going on behind the scenes, and her talking about it openly, that he was cheating on her in a way that she hadn't before, and the hatred that the royal family has for her. And of course, this was seen by a lot of people who are in support of the royal family as her turning herself into the victim, twisting the narrative in a way to make it seem like she was the ultimate innocent in all of this. So it was a very controversial interview from what I remember.
It was huge.
Yeah.
I was 10 and I just remember it as if it were yesterday. This aired on BBC, I think, Newsnight. And the next day, it's all anyone around me was talking about. It was absolutely monumental, that interview.
Even all the 10-year-olds were talking about that?
Oh, no. But our parents, and we could hear our teachers at school talking about it.
My understanding is that it was all done secretly, that nobody knew this thing was going to come out until it came out.
Yeah.
That's a move. Regardless of how you feel about the parties, this is a lot to dump. And what we have here, of course, isn't just seeing the interview, but we're seeing the Queen watch the interview, which I'm sure, at these times, these clips are being played ad nauseum.
Do you think you will ever be Queen?
No, I don't. No.
Why do you think that?
I'd like to be a queen of people's hearts, in people's hearts. But I don't see myself being queen of this country.
Saying the queen of the people's hearts, that is totally a line you thought of in advance. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
That is not a thing that you just came up with in that moment, in my opinion. And Elizabeth's watching this, and Philip walks in, and I can't imagine what this is like to be hearing this stuff again and again after all of the trauma.
I don't think many people would want me to be queen. Actually, when I say many people, I mean the establishment that I'm married into.
Why do you think it's important that Elizabeth is watching this right now in the film?
Ooh. Well, maybe to go along with what Charles said, this idea that we had her drop the shade line in that moment, or the script had her drop the shade line in that moment, but then right afterwards we see that, no, she's in this group, whether she likes it or not. And this is further proof that Diana she starts to see, maybe starts to sympathize a little bit more here by seeing this interview. Because I think, doesn't Philip walk in and is like taking his dribble off and blah, blah, blah. So we see now that she is starting to, at least in the construct of the movie, to maybe sympathize a little bit with what Diana endured from them. Now I don't know if any of this is true, obviously, but it seems like that's what we're seeing. And especially because Philip storms out because she won't turn it off. And maybe she's starting to see like, well, we were a bit harsh on her. Maybe now in death, looking at it in retrospect, maybe I should have listened to her more, especially as Charles just threw her under the bus in the car, or tried to. So the perspective of it all maybe is shifting for her as she watches this interview.
So you said something, John, about, knowing whether or not how she really felt or what. And I think, again, I'm just going to say, we don't know that any of this happened.
That's true.
This is all just the imagined. We don't know what Elizabeth was actually watching or how she was reacting to it or what Philip was saying. We don't know any of that. But
Dame Judi Dench should be issuing a a request for this to be considered a fictional portrayal of the royalty very soon, I'm sure.
Well, I think so.
She did about the crown.
The thing that I think is that it's not so much that I feel like she's becoming more sympathetic with Diana. What I think is that she is becoming more aware of the narrative that she is not going to be able to fight.
Oh, fair point. That she is the subject of. Yeah. Good point. Yeah.
That there's a certain point where it's like, well, this is what people think.
So, Steve, I know you listened to the podcast I did with Gareth Russell about the Queen Mother because you emailed about it. And he had this line about the Queen's Mother ostriching when I asked him what his criticism of her was. And he said the Queen exhibited some of this as well. This ostriching was putting one's head in the sand and ignoring issues, problems, even crises. And I interpreted the Queen's refusal to turn off the television, which of course she wanted to do herself, I imagine, as a refusal for the first time to ostrich, to look away.
Yes.
It's time to acknowledge what has happened and absorb it, was how I saw.
Yeah, I 100%. Well, and Philip's like, just turn it off.
Yeah.
And they talk about, how they felt about Diana when they first became engaged.
We encouraged the match. We signed off on it, both of us. You were very enthusiastic, remember?
And I love Philip's line.
She was a nice girl. Then?
Then he says.
And I was sure he'd give the other one up. Or at least make sure his wife toed the line.
When he says this, and this is where I love filmmaking, is it is so clear they cut to Elizabeth and her eyes flick up to him at the sentence, "toed the line."
Mm-hmm.
What just happened?
Well, for me, it's funny to see this after I've seen The Crown, because The Crown in the first 2 seasons makes a point of showing the fact that Philip bristled initially at being married to Elizabeth and it was alluded to that he was unfaithful. And I don't remember it fully if they show scenes of him being unfaithful, but there was certainly that was that expectation that he would keep that under wraps and whatever. So I think in that moment, because Helen Mirren is such a brilliant actress, just the look up from her with her eyes is referencing, stuff that still bothers her to that day of his dalliances, shall we say, when they were first married or getting together. And so and it also speaks to the patriarchy, this idea that a man can, flippantly have multiple affairs, but if a woman does it, especially a queen, it's looked down upon as something horrific. So it's working on a number of levels, this back and forth between them. And it's fascinating that Philip doesn't see her react to him and she can react behind his back, because that could probably cause a whole new level of anger and arguments from the past. So I think it's just speaking volumes about their relationship and about even within the Queen and Prince Philip, he is seen as a little bit of the man over the woman type situation. So at least that's how I took it.
No, I'm with you, and I love the moment where he literally continues digging his own hole on a certain level and says,
"Isn't that what everyone does?"
And she says,
"Is it?"
It's so funny. I mean, like, there's so much of filmmaking where, and obviously this is a very British film with as British people as we can get with the monarchy, but there's so much of filmmaking where it is, don't say what is actually going on. Let us see into it. If she had said, "Wait, Philip, are you saying that you had an affair and that I was supposed to toe the line?" Like, the scene would have been so much worse,
Right. It's too obvious. You can put a nose. Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you call that, Steve? Hang a lantern on it? You can't hang a lantern.
Anyway, Philip leaves and she continues to watch this footage, and they cut to shots of Camilla. And finally, it's like there's this moment where she's like, "Okay, I've had enough. I don't need to watch this anymore." And she changes the channel. And what does she change the channel to? More Diana. It's inescapable.
I think it's a disgrace on the whole royal family.
Okay, the Queen's not in residence today, but where the hell is the flag?
And we see the empty flagpole over Buckingham Palace.
Will someone please save these people from themselves?
And then we cut to, I will say, the most domestic scene in the entire film with the royals, which is we're out at Balmoral and Philip is barbecuing and Helen Mirren shows up with some Tupperware of some stew. By the way, Helen Mirren made the decision that it was really important to her that she actually creates a sense of a family. So she arranged for multiple times for the royal family, including James Cromwell and Alex Jennings and Sylvia Sims, all to just hang out together.
Wow.
Just so they could feel more like a real family. She says, by the way, this scene is her favorite scene in the movie.
Helen Mirren does.
Yeah. And what Stephen Frears said about it was he said the whole goal was to make a very human film about people that we don't think about as human. And I really think that's what this scene does.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just the fact that Philip is struggling to get the grill lit, and the Tupperware and the dogs and all of that stuff.
Yeah, the fact that the wife brought the stew just in case the husband could get this thing turned on.
That's all the stuff, that's the normal family stuff. And what we're hearing about is this issue of the flag. And Philip just goes off.
And I hope Robin told him there isn't a flag above Buckingham Palace. There's the royal standard, which flies for one reason only, to denote the presence of the monarch. Since you're here, the flagpole is bare, which is as it should be. It's more than 400 years old. Never been lowered for anyone.
Your grandfather didn't get the flag at half-mast when he died. And if your mother died tomorrow, she wouldn't either.
By the way, do you know, did they fly a flag at half-mast when Queen Elizabeth did die?
I don't know. That's a good question.
Yeah, that's a good question.
I bet they did. I bet it changed because of this. It's funny. At the beginning of our conversation last time, Charlie, you brought up this idea of the stability added to the system because the monarch exists, and Tony Blair or the prime minister visiting her creates a continuity that doesn't exist in our system. And not to get political, because the three of us would probably go off on a some ridiculous tangent, but one place I think we agree is I've been thinking a lot about this idea of partiality and consistency, and like at the very beginning of the movie, that the Queen says it would be nice to be partial sometime. And I started thinking about like all these traditions that we're talking about here. This is how you do it. Those create a sense of consistency, and that's impartial. And I just started thinking about there are all these elements in our own system that should be impartial that are becoming increasingly more and more partial and politicized. And I just go, man, maybe that's another value of the monarchy, of just having this solid thing that cannot be corrupted theoretically by politics, I
feel like,
well, and this is where I suppose my small c conservatism comes in, because I had a great deal of time for Philip's argument in this scene. Because the thing is if you're going to have that continuity, then you have to have rules.
Yeah.
And you can't have those rules corrupted or altered by politics, but also by sentiment.
Yes.
And Philip is right here. Now, again, what is it that eventually happens if you are too small c conservative? You get washed away. And perhaps in this case, that was too much of a stickler's point. But you see the tension that I like so much in this movie, because Philip is right and Tony Blair is right.
Yeah.
Philip is right to say, no, that's not how it works. You are this apolitical, detached source of continuity. And yes, it's a slightly earlier moment, but Blair is right to say, will someone save these people from themselves? But I thought he was right. I mean, I'm watching this thinking, yeah, exactly.
Well, that is what it is. It is the royal standard, and this is what it means. And therefore, to fly it at half-mast when they're not there is violating the meaning of the thing. But I think it's just a really interesting thing of, there are times when you should hold on to the tradition because that's the tradition. Right. And then there are times when the meaning has shifted and the tradition has ceased to be the thing that you think it is. And holding on to it is holding on to an anachronism that is no longer serving you.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the funniest things when you hear people think that they know how to rule. Like they're like, oh, you should do this. You have no idea till you walk into those halls, like what is required of the situation and how you have to walk that line and figure. It's like parenting almost. Like you have to know when to lay the foot down, when not to lay the foot down, when to contradict yourself. on a case-by-case basis. And I imagine you both can speak to this more than I can. But
Literally, that's what we were talking about before you came on the call, was me trying to get my kid to school this morning.
That's what I'm saying. Being a child that had parents, I know what it's, what it's like to have that feeling, and it's fascinating to watch. And at times I've hungered for political office, and then when I see the behind the scenes of it, the machinations of it all, and how quickly the public can turn on you over a decision, or if you're not reading the room right, it takes a lot out of you. There's a reason those presidents walk out after 8 years and they look like 30 years older than they did when they went in. It's just so much. And so I can see Charlie is saying, like, Philip is right in terms of the actual letter of the law. And there is a way you can watch this movie through Charles's prism. If you were a fan of Charles, you'd be like, Charles seems to be right on all of this, because Charles is the one that says, well, maybe the flag is just blah, 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 because he doesn't want to risk his father's ire. So he's trying to employ him in a way that's a little more softer in the approach, like, well, maybe some people don't see it that way, Dad. Maybe it's something else, and so you see the kind of back and forth that's going on. And it's essentially a political discussion that happens in families. So I think, like you said, Steve, it goes back to the feeling that this is a real family. Yes, they're the queen mother and Prince Philip, but they're actually human beings in a family, and they're interacting about this situation.
Well, and it's a generational discussion politically that happens in families, which is like, yeah, Dad, I know that this is how it used to work, but this is how people are today, and you're not getting in on it. The thing I've been thinking about, and not just about this movie, but just thinking about this a lot lately, is I've just been thinking, like, I almost want to write like an essay on defensive lip service. Like, there used to be a time where people would say the stuff you were supposed to say. Someone would die, and then you would say, oh, he's a great blah, blah, blah. And you would go on and say those things. Or you'd say, oh, my honorable person of the other party who so-and-so. And then you would say something. And we all know that you hated him, but that's what you said. And, like, we have lost that. That doesn't really exist in this country anymore. Everybody is saying the nastiest things they could possibly say. And I feel like, and it's so funny, because if you'd asked me 15 years ago, I'd be like, oh, all that lip service is just bullshit. I mean, it's just, why are we surrounded by so much bullshit? And now I'm kind of going, man, I miss the bullshit. I miss when people would just say the thing you were supposed to say in that moment.
This is my point, that the fickleness of, the fickleness of the public. In one moment, you're okay with the lip service. Then you don't like the lip service. Now you want the lip service back. So it's just like, you just never, it's a case. I always take it as a case by case basis.
How dare you call me fickle?
I apologize, sir. I apologize.
And then I love the moment as Philip gets more and more irate about Blair's suggestion. He says,
the next thing he'll be suggesting you change your name to Hilda and mine to Hector. Who does he think he's talking to? You're the sovereign, the head of state. You don't get dictated to.
As he's dictating to her.
I mean, he's very clear. And then this other moment, and again, this just struck me weird every time it happened, which is then she shushes him because the boys might overhear who are like across the river. And it's just this treatment of them as always just out of sight, always just out of range. It felt really weird watching the movie for me this time.
Oh, that's another hour of the movie if you were bringing the kids into this. So I think they made the right sacrifice to tell the overall story that they're telling, because it's called The Queen.
It's really because of the more recent things that have happened with that generation.
Sure.
That's why it struck me that way. Not because of, I don't think I felt that way when I first saw the film.
Oh, fair enough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then we go back to the mourners and the news footage, and it is just every time it's bigger.
Mm-hmm.
The number of flowers in Kensington Place, the number of barricades, the lines for signing these books, and we start to see some of the notes that are written that are being hung up. And one, there's a sign that says, Diana, deceived in marriage, hounded by the establishment, but respected and appreciated by us all. And we intercut that with the beautiful footage of Diana looking beautiful and smiling. And then we cut to this scene with Charles, which we talked about at the very beginning of the show, where he says,
well, in one sense, it's comforting. For the first time, my parents can see what it's been like for me all these years, being up against her popularity.
I'm sure both of you had this thing of like, finally you get it, and then he says these lines, which I quoted at the very beginning of the show.
Oh, but they're still making the mistake of thinking the Diana they knew from living and dealing with her will eventually be the one seen by the public, but it won't. The two Dianas The public's and ours bear no relation to one another at all.
I think that is, it honestly says so much about where we are today. That there's so much is built on how we perceive a person, not the reality.
What Charles says in that scene is true, but it's also true for unusual reasons. In that, if you go back to the 50s in Hollywood, no one ever went out of their house without looking glorious.
Yeah.
So every photograph, you know better than I do, from the 1950s, the person in them, the celebrity in them, is impeccable. Whereas now we see photos on TMZ of a movie star walking around in sweatpants with, you know, acne and greasy hair. And it would be tempting to assume that if you were entering an era in which people had these two discrete personas, that what they saw would be more like 1950s Hollywood than now. In other words, you know, no one will ever know what Grace Kelly looks like when she's tired.
Right.
But actually, the relationship between Charles and Diana had broken down in public.
Right.
I mean, they had seen all of their warts. They'd seen all of their problems.
Yeah.
They'd seen each other bitching about each other. And yet, despite all of that, and despite all of the secrets coming out and all of the behind-the-scenes information being made public, still he's thinking, my goodness, they don't know her. They have these two conceptions. And I mean, as somebody who was jealous of her right from the beginning of their marriage, and he used to, you know, when I saw this on The Crown, I wondered if it was true, so I looked it up. He used to really lose his temper when the crowds preferred her to him when they visited foreign countries, most notably Australia.
Yeah. He's
sitting there and he's thinking, well, even now, after all of this, they still idolize her.
Yeah.
Which I think was less rational than I know John does. But either way, Charles is presumably cross about this. And I thought that was really poignant because he's never got over it and nothing will dispel it.
I think a psychiatrist would have an absolute field day dissecting Charles. If you were to sit him in a room and remove him from access to the outside world, and he would have to divulge everything, like you break him down where he actually told the truth about the entire progress of his life, it would be a fascinating case study, to be honest with you. Because even now, when he became king, they had that video of him losing his temper with the pen because it stained his hands. And people defended him saying, well, how would you react if your mother had just died, blah, blah, blah. But it just plays into the narrative that Charles is this pampered, spoiled, angry, temperamental, condescending, conceited guy because the public has been brought up for generations to see him in this way by the PR machine that was behind Diana. Now, it's not saying it's not incorrect. It could very well be true. But the guy can't win, no matter what he does, with a large section of the populace. And I think that's all residue of Diana. And that's never going to go away, I think, no matter what he does. But it's also because of how he was raised, how he was, you know, processed through this family and what have you. So, yeah.
I was just thinking, so John knows this. I had a very kind of public, very, very, very painful split with a really, really good friend of mine. And there was a narrative that he had about what had happened in our friendship, and it didn't match what my narrative was. And I just suddenly went, man, what would happen if years later he died? And then I just heard his narrative from all quarters come out about who I was and what had happened and why things went that way. And being totally incapable of arguing with the narrative, no matter how painful it might have been for me. You know, like, what a weird and I'm not saying, I'm not defending Charles. I don't know enough to really say anything either way, but the pain of it, I certainly can appreciate, you know. And then we cut to, and I literally had to stop and rewind and check and go, wait, is that Tracy Ullman? Because Tracy Ullman shows up in news footage. It's very weird. And she is just railing against the monarchy and, you know, praising Tony Blair to the nines. And then we cut to Tony in his house with his wife, and she's excited about this. She says,
You know, maybe this time people will find they've seen them for what they actually are.
Which is?
A bunch of freeloading, emotionally retarded nutters.
So she's not mincing her words.
Yeah.
And Tony pushes back. And my question is, 10 years ago, was Tony on totally the same page with her, or was he always not on the same page with her?
Well, I think he was not on the same page. I think he is more pragmatic. I think he also had a different job than she did. So she's a barrister, and she's a very good one. And her job is to press her view or her client's view to the max, which is what she does. And although I think Tony Blair did not share her view of the monarchy, he had a different job than she did, which is to represent the country. And what she's saying is completely impractical.
Mm-hmm.
And he has a responsibility as prime minister not to indulge it. So I think you see that coming through. But no, he was always a lot more conservative than she was.
They live in a ludicrous cocoon of privilege and wealth. I mean, they don't pay tax.
Yes, they do.
Not on all their income. The Queen alone costs us, what, 30, 40 million a year?
Look, if you want to have a serious conversation
I do.
about the Constitution.
We don't have one.
The entire reason that Charlie is on this show, frankly, is that as I was watching this, I went, wait, sometimes they say they have a constitution or something is constitutional. Sometimes they say they don't have a constitution. And I wrote to Charlie and said, what is this all about with the Constitution? Oh, by the way, how would you feel about coming on the show? So, Charlie, what is this all about with the Constitution?
Well, what Britain does not have is a written constitution in one place. The United States has the longest serving intact constitution in the world. And it's different than most constitutions for a couple of reasons. First, it's all there in one place. And second, it sits above Congress and the president and the courts.
Right.
In Britain, Parliament is sovereign. But that doesn't mean that there are no constitutional principles in British law. The British Constitution is a strange mix of laws that were passed through Parliament, conventions, and writing by observers and academics that has been taken as gospel. So it's not true that Britain doesn't have a constitution. Now, there is a little context to this. When this took place in 1997, there was a movement within the Labour Party that had just won to formalize and alter more of the British constitutional order. And so although Tony Blair never really picked it up and ran with it, his party is interested in constitutional reform and wants to write more down than had been written down. So it's possible that line was reflecting Cherie Blair's preference for this. And she may have been on that wing of the party. I've never actually looked that up.
It's great to have you on the show for that level of expertise. That's fantastic.
On that one.
And as he is defending the monarchy to some degree and saying basically that it's daft, she says,
It's not a mother thing, is it?
What?
Well, if she were alive now, your mother would be exactly the same age. I mean, you're always saying how stoical she was. Old-fashioned, uncomplaining, lived through the war. I mean, come on, who does that sound like?
As I was researching, this is what's really interesting about this moment. So Stephen Frears said that he genuinely did admire the Queen and said, he said it's hard not to admire her. She's clearly an extraordinary woman. And then he started talking about, well, she's part of my parents' generation. And he said, this is Stephen Frears. He said, so in celebrating her, we're really celebrating our parents, their stoicism, enduring the war. And in a completely separate interview, Peter Morgan said that, frankly, he modeled the Queen after his mom.
Wow. Interesting.
What I think is kind of amazing about that is, in the end, the artist has to make the thing that they're making personal. There's the quote that Helen Mirren said at the very beginning about playing the Queen, which was, you're like a portrait painter, and a portrait painter is not a photographer. Your job is not to just reproduce reality. Your job is to take your own self and your own emotions as an artist and apply them to this canvas. And the fact that both Stephen Frears and Peter Morgan on some level were thinking of their moms is, I think, what part of what gives this character so much life. Is Tony Blair thinking of his mom?
I think so. Who's going to know you better than your wife? And who's going to know your issues better than your wife? And I think when the look Michael Sheen gives her, which is great, and then he just walks right out of the room is perfect, because it's a way of like, I'm not talking about this.
Don't get into moms. Isn't that like a basic rule?
Yeah.
Tony is practicing a speech that's been written for it, and it contains the word revolution, and he kind of wigs out on his staff. Why is he upset about this?
Oh, I don't know. As a Brit, does the word revolution, does it bring up old stuff? I don't know.
We've never had one.
Well, I mean,
there are arguments that the English Civil War was a revolution, or maybe the Glorious Revolution was a revolution, although it wasn't really. I read it in a couple of ways. First off, it's another way of establishing that he's not actually as radical as many of the people who were around him when he was elected. I also saw it as a continuation of his argument with his wife.
That's what I think, yeah. Is that it's directly his wife is pushing essentially for revolution, and now he feels like his staff is pushing in that direction too.
Well, he pitched himself as this modern, when he campaigned, he pitched himself as this guy who was going to reflect modern Britain. And so why wouldn't his staff and his wife push him to actually, adhere to his words? So it's just such similarities here between him and, as I said, not to get too political, between him and Obama, this idea of, these guys were going to come in and change. Like with Clinton, you knew that was a political animal. He was a political animal that was going to survive. If he had to chew through you, he was going to survive. With Obama and Blair, it felt like, and Charlie, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it felt like they were both coming in with this mandate to modernize the approach, to make us the shining beacon on the hill, respectively, in each of those countries, and bring a sense of pride back and show us the best that we can be and change things and fight for the common man. And it felt that way for both these. But then by the end of their time, there was a lot of disappointment from the people who had put them in. Even though the other option was certainly not one that they were going to choose, there was still a disappointment that all this promise essentially didn't fully flourish by the end of their terms. And I think this is a moment where you see maybe an allusion to that he's not going to fully make this revolution or do this revolution that he campaigned on.
Well, I'll tread carefully on the Obama.
Just to comment on this, to me, like there's that old expression of that you campaign in poetry, but you govern in prose. And to me, it seems like the better the poetry, the bigger the disappointment when you switch to prose. And Obama was certainly big on poetry. The other thing I think that's really interesting is that we're going to cut to this scene with the Queen where she's getting a call from the Prime Minister, and immediately Philip, it goes,
"Tell him to call back."
It's so funny because I love James Cromwell. I think his character is very one note in this. Not that he doesn't play that note really well. But the other thing I think is interesting is here we have these two people, political figures at the central of the film, and both of their spouses are completely unflexible about their opinion of what is supposed to happen. And they're trying to navigate this in a world that is, again, it's governing in prose. You can't be unflexible. You have to figure this stuff out.
Prime Minister?
Good morning, Your Majesty. Sorry to disturb, but I was just wondering whether you'd seen any of today's papers.
Now, of course, she's seen all the papers.
We've managed to look at one or two, yes.
This is not an easy call for Tony Blair to make. And of course, we don't know if he made this call. Like, we don't know exactly what they were saying to each other at this time.
In which case, my next question would be whether you felt some kind of response might be necessary.
I love the levels of strength in the way that you make a statement. Because you could say, I really think you should make a response.
Right.
But he doesn't. He says, I wonder.
No. I believe a few over-eager editors are doing their best to sell newspapers, and it would be a mistake to dance to their tune.
Charlie, I'll ask you this question. Other than this, were Queen Elizabeth's political instincts up to this point generally correct?
Yes.
That's what I would think too. And it's tough when you've had one system and the system worked, and now the system's not working. It's very difficult to adjust to.
So, what would you suggest, Prime Minister? Some kind of a statement?
No, ma'am. I believe the moment for statements has passed. I would suggest flying the flag at half-mast above Buckingham Palace and coming down to London at the earliest opportunity.
Philip, who's been listening to this, is not pleased. And then he says, and this moment is kind of amazing.
It would be a great comfort to your people and would help them with their grief.
And the moment he says their grief, she picks up the phone and says,
There. Grief. If you imagine I'm going to drop everything and come down to London before I attend to my grandchildren who've just lost their mother, then you're mistaken.
What do you think, John? What do you think has happened here?
Well, I think that she's allowed him as the queen, because God knows how many prime ministers. Well, there is. You can know there's 14 or whatever. She dealt with a lot of prime ministers in her time while she was queen, and certainly through some very tumultuous times in the country's history. So, and also dealing with the men in her life, she's kind of cultivated this patience, this natural patience. So with Tony, she's allowed him to call her, to suggest things. She's pushed back where she's felt she needed to push back. But this was the line that was finally crossed, and with the line too far. And I think this is her pushing back at him. And in a way, the film itself, it's what I love about the film presents both sides equally. I may be a liberal or progressive or, and at the time slightly conservative in my points of views, but like, I like a film that presents both sides so that you as the viewer can decide where you want to land. And I think this is one of those moments. Tony does have the right advice in this moment, but the queen is also saying to him, the public can cry all they want, but we are actually dealing with the day-to-day grief of these children, and that also must be respected. So I like that she's pushing back strongly here to make it clear to him, you chill out for a second. There's other stuff going on here that you're not factoring in to this situation that maybe you are unaware of or have forgotten. So I like that.
I doubt there is anyone who knows the British people more than I do, Mr. Blair, nor who has greater faith in their wisdom and judgment.
I always find it weird when someone who's lived behind walls and barely interact. At one point, they say she hasn't walked among her people since the end of World War II, saying nobody knows the British people better than I do. It's like, I don't think you've been hanging out with them much.
And it is my belief that they will any moment reject this mood, which is being stirred up by the press, in favor of a period of restrained grief and sober private mourning. That's the way we do things in this country. Quietly, with dignity.
So let me ask you two a question, because we're in 2022. And hearing Elizabeth say, Queen Elizabeth say, it's some overeager editors. It's the press manipulating the narrative. It's the media. In essence, the press is essentially code word for the media. And her saying that she's not going to let them dictate her life. I don't remember this being a thing back then like it is now. And maybe because I just kind of read what I read and I didn't think it was that big of it. And people didn't see me. I didn't listen to the people who made such a big deal about it. But it seems to be a massive deal now on both sides, accusing the media of doing one thing or another. And seeing it here in this movie, I wonder if it struck you guys differently seeing it now, considering where we are and what we've dealt with over the last few years with the constant questioning of the media from both sides.
Well, I think that the press was deeply irresponsible at this period of time, so I didn't interrogate that too closely because I heard her say it and thought, yeah, that's true. And I'm pretty critical of the media now as well, so I suppose I have a seamless garment going all the way back to that point. Of course, she is wrong at one level because she thinks that this is entirely media-driven.
Right.
And that it will go away, and it's not going to, but...
Let me clarify, because we're seeing more politicians say that it's the media creating these things to cover their wrongdoings when it's obvious that it's their wrongdoings, that it's the media who's fabricating this. It's not true, and when it is true. And so it's a default defense mechanism. And I see it here in a different prism when I watch the movie now in 2022. So I guess that's what I was getting at.
I think we are what we eat. I think that whatever you consume in terms of information defines how you see the world.
Yeah.
That if you are, and the media has always controlled narratives and controlled emotional narratives because that's how people understood what was going on in the world. And whether it was, if you look at racist cartoons coming out of Hollywood during World War II, or that was how the media was trying to shape, this is what this is. This is how you should see this. And there are times when the media, I think, has been more moderate and responsible and times less so. And I also think that with modern technology, just the level of power and the way that power is wielded and the speed of it is much, much different and continues to get more and more intense, I would say, is a way to put it. That's the first thought I have. The second one is that it's so funny because this came out of Charlie. I do this other podcast on Star Trek, and there's an episode of Star Trek where we were talking about Mr. Spock, and I was associated with Mr. Spock. That's like everything should be logical. Emotions shouldn't get in the way of stuff. That's how I thought. And I remember having this epiphany when I was having a fight with my wife, where it was a fight about something where she believed something that wasn't actually exactly true, but she was really upset about it. I'm like, well, we've just proven that the thing that you're upset about isn't true, so you should stop being upset. And she's like, no, I am upset. That's how I feel. Like, you can't say, and I'm like, yeah, but your feelings aren't justified because the thing. Oof. So needless to say, this argument did not go well.
For you.
But the big lesson that I learned, and it took me a while to learn, is like, oh, her feelings are real. The emotions that someone is having, regardless of whether or not they're based on anything rational or real, or it can be based entirely on bullshit, they're having those emotions, and you have to deal with that. And so we can say that which I think, Charlie, you said in the first episode, that this is so overblown, that it was almost this mass insanity that happened. And I agree with that. The degree of the emotions about this one person is just totally out of proportion. But the emotions are real. This is, in fact, what is happening. And so while Philip might be right and the Queen might be right that this is how you're supposed to do it, there is a reality going on here, and you have to deal with the reality one way or another. By the way, one of the things, Helen Mirren really did admire the Queen despite disagreeing with her on all sorts of things. And what she admired, she said, was her constancy. And then she said this about her, which I think is fascinating. She said, the Queen is blessed with a lack of imagination, relentlessly and endlessly consistent. Blessed with a lack of imagination is an amazing thing to say.
That's absolutely brutal.
But she's saying it as a compliment in a weird way.
In a weird way, yeah. But it's essentially saying ignorance is bliss.
I don't think so. I think there's a difference between ignorance and a lack of imagination. Mm-hmm. Like, you could know a ton of stuff, but not. My dad was a brilliant guy, but he did not have the biggest imagination.
I can see that.
Yeah, he knew so much stuff, was so smart at so many things, but he was not an inventive thinker at all.
Yeah. But I also think she's saying that there's almost a sense of freedom in having a lack of options and having a lack of being muddied by all the different perspectives, right? And so you can also look at it in that way, that she has something she has to adhere to. She knows she has to adhere to it. It's consistent. And so there's almost a bliss in that, as opposed to being, like we all are, bombarded by different perspectives, points of views, and whatever. And we have to figure out where we stand on something. And that can change depending on what new information comes filtering through our experiences.
If that's your decision, ma'am, of course the government will support it. Let's keep in touch.
Yes, let's.
At this point, I'm just curious to gauge, what is your feeling about the Queen at this moment? Have you become more sympathetic, less sympathetic?
I think I'm more fascinated at this stage in the film. Like, I'm very curious. I feel more sympathy for her, for sure, while also reminding myself of the way she spoke of Diana. And so I am challenged as a viewer to navigate this with a bit more understanding and perspective. And I like that.
This is the point at which I become less sympathetic. Because I think at that point it's obvious what needs to be done. And as a viewer, you've been led to see it. And you're sitting on the outside for the first time, aware. Also, because it's a true story, and if you know what happened, you know that she gave in. And so she's now in no man's land, where she's refusing to give in, but she probably knows that she has to. And even if she doesn't, we know. And we know that she did. And so you're sitting there, well, I was anyway, getting a little bit frustrated, thinking, okay, can you not see now? This is imperative.
I'm less sympathetic too. I think part of it comes from the fact that I know of the three of us the least about Charles and about all this stuff that was going on. And so coming off of those scenes with Charles and him criticizing her, and it like that made me feel less sympathetic to her too. So then, and going like, look, what you're doing isn't working.
I understand how difficult her behaviour must seem to you, how unhelpful. But try and see it from her perspective. She just won't have seen anything like this since the abdication, and I cannot emphasise enough what effect that had on her. Unexpectedly becoming king as good as killed her father.
How important was that?
Oh, it's huge.
Yeah.
It was huge. The Queen's mother never forgave Edward VII for abdicating.
Oh, wow.
Edward VIII. And her whole life, she referred to him, to Wallace Simpson, who Edward married and abdicated to marry, as that woman who killed my husband.
Wow.
And this will have trickled down to Elizabeth, there's no question about it. Because, of course, Elizabeth never expected to become queen. There was no reason she would have become queen. So she would have been deeply aware of how she got there and how traumatizing it was.
So Tony has agreed to help out on some level. We're back at Balmoral, and the Queen kind of enters the hunting office and asks where they're stalking today.
One of the lads will drive you.
No, that's all right. I'll manage. Thank you.
This next sequence is it moves me so much. And this is just where I don't know how you came up with it. I don't know why, but it's so powerful to me. She gets in that Range Rover. She starts driving. She's going over very bumpy terrain. And just watching the Queen shift gears as she's four-wheel driving is just kind of fun. And one of the things that Stephen Frears said was he wanted you to think about who this woman was if she wasn't the Queen. What would she have been? And apparently there's a quote with her when she was asked as a young girl, what would you like to be when you grow up? And she says, I would like to be a lady living in the country with lots of horses and dogs. And that's who this is that we're seeing. Apparently she loved driving herself. She gets to the river. She hits the water. She's driving through. There's a huge bounce. We hear a bang. Truck stops. And she says, apparently there were many people who were not happy hearing the Queen say this word. This is a controversial thing. And she gets out and is kind of hanging out of the door and is in the river looking under the car. And none of this is things I could ever have imagined the Queen doing.
I'm afraid I've done something rather foolish. I've broken the prop shaft crossing the river.
Are you sure, ma'am?
Yes, of course I'm sure. It's the front one, not the rear. Lost the four-wheel drive. Don't forget I used to be a mechanic during the war.
Which is true. And they say they're going to send someone, and she says she's perfectly all right. I'll wait by the car. And she sits there just on the side of the river. She takes off her scarf. She looks around at nature and she sighs. And like I said, so much of this movie is trying to figure out what's going on in her head. And the shot is kind of a wide shot of her sitting behind the car, and then a closer shot, but it's shot from behind. We don't see her face. And that to me is one of the most, and it is one of the most brilliant choices. And of course, it's the one that I would never have made because I always want to see the thing. And they're choosing not to let you see her. And slowly from behind, she begins to sob. Yeah. It is so moving to me. And this is the turn of the film for me. Like in the last scene, I went, my sympathy is pretty low for her. And now I'm watching her alone. She just broke her car and she's sitting there. And then as she sobs, her head is out of focus, and in focus behind her, we see that stag. And she turns and she looks at it, and Helen Mirren, man. I mean, there's so much going on, and I started to cry. I don't know what is so moving to me about this scene.
You're old. You're old.
True.
That's what happens. We get softer as we get older. But yeah, I mean, I've read so many articles in preparation for this podcast episode about the symbolism of the stag. And first of all, Stephen Frears, the director, shot her from behind because he felt like the British public couldn't handle seeing the Queen cry. Like he didn't want them to see the Queen crying, and so that was why he shot it that way, which he stated in interviews. So, but the other side of this, the stag can. I've seen so many articles, read so many fantastic descriptions of what they think the stag represents. Is it the monarchy of the past, how it used to stand strong like that? Is it Diana? Is it herself, how she was, and she's glimpsing now that her way of doing things as she's gotten older are now no longer as proud and strong as they used to be, so that when the stag is killed, in essence, It could mirror the death of Diana. It could mirror the death of the possible death of the monarchy. It could mirror the death of her own reign as the queen in terms of being loved by the public, or her own old ways that have always served her well. So it's genius to hear how people have dissected this idea of what the stag represents at this moment in the movie. But at its base level, it is just her seeing a proud creature that eventually is taken down. And I think she feels a human connection to it as an avid hunter herself, and an appreciation for these animals when they hunt them.
And then as she's watching...
Like, she's not taking Instagram photos like some jerks do with... You know what I'm saying? That's what I'm getting at.
Listen, the Queen's Instagram feed would be very popular. I think she'd become an influencer in no time.
Oh, my God.
But as she's watching, then she hears the sound of the hunters. She hears the dog.
Shoo! Shoo, go on.
She's sided with the stag, and there's this moment that she's genuinely getting worried, and then she turns and looks back, and the stag is gone. And man, that smile, like this person, it's to me, it's an amazing magic trick, because this person who a scene ago I really wasn't a fan of, who seemed kind of almost inhuman in a lot of ways, has been completely humanized for me now. And then she wipes away that tear, and then she takes on that queen's face again. You know what I mean? Like, now she's the queen again.
What do you think of the symbolism, Charlie? Do you think it's all ridiculous, or do you kind of see the connection of tissue?
I don't know. I thought you might ask me that, and I thought it might expose the shortcomings in my ability to interpret movies.
Well, I apologize.
Because this is the sort of part of movie analysis that I've never been good at.
Well, let me ask you a different question.
I guess.
How did you feel watching it?
Well, I noticed two things in this scene. The first was these little class markers that are just so fascinating in Britain, because she breaks down in her car and she's stranded, and she calls on her cell phone and essentially instructs them to rescue her. And then when the guy says, "Oh, we'll be there straight away," she says, "Oh, would you?" As if she hadn't thought about it. And that's such an English way of papering over the fact that she's the queen and the person she's calling works for her. It's a pretense that isn't the case. That was nicely done. The one thought I had about the stag was that it was an implicit criticism of Philip.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
I could see that.
Okay.
Because earlier on, I think we talked about this last time, the only thing he can think to do is hunt.
Yes. Right.
And then she's standing there and she doesn't want this stag to be killed.
Right.
And she sees it as this fragile and beautiful creature. And I wondered if it was a way of breaking with the past, or saying she's recognized that things have to change.
But now it's time finally. Yeah.
This is what's so great about the moment, frankly, is that there's just, to me, there's like so much emotion in it, and we can interpret a lot. For me, it's just, I always associate that she is the stag. She's being hunted. She's this noble creature who's going to be brought down, or everyone is trying to get, who's trying to survive. But it could be any of these things. We cut to Tony, who's getting ready for a news conference, and Sherry, it continues to be all over him about the monarchy.
Allowing her to hang herself might not be in our best interests either. Besides, I think there's something ugly about the way everyone started to bully her.
It's funny. The other film that John and I are working on right now is Misery, which is the great Stephen King story with James Caan. And that is a movie that is, one of its themes is about celebrity and stalkers and how people create a relationship with someone even though they don't know them. And there's a strange connection to this film in that way, is people have created a relationship, obviously, with Diana, and people create a relationship with who they think the queen is. And then they feel perfectly comfortable coming after her when she doesn't behave the way they want her to.
How are the boys?
Not so good tonight. A lot of slamming doors. I think they saw the papers.
Oh, no.
And then Philip says, because this is his solution to everything,
I'll take them out early again tomorrow morning. Let them take it out on the stag.
Like, dude, maybe something else, you know?
The family should have come down.
to Buckingham Palace on Sunday afternoon. All of them. That girl's been left on her own. She's on her own up there, and the place is empty.
The pressure is continuing, and the pressure is both criticizing the Queen and elevating Tony Blair, who they now describe as more popular than Churchill. To which I kind of went, Churchill in what year?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
She goes out to walk the dogs, and there's another call from the Prime Minister, and she goes into the kitchen to take it. And I love, she's very polite to kicking out all the people out of the kitchen on the one hand. And on the other hand, it's kind of what you were saying before, Charlie, about the being the boss and then being polite about the guy coming to get you.
A poll that's to be published in tomorrow's papers suggests that 70% of people believe that your actions have damaged the monarchy, and that 1 in 4 are now in favor of abolishing the monarchy altogether.
First of all, that's huge.
As your Prime Minister, I believe it is my constitutional responsibility to advise the following.
Again, we have this word constitutional, which now pops out every time I hear it. We don't hear what he says, but we cut to her alone in the kitchen thinking about it. And she goes to see the person that sometimes you need to talk to when you're in a rough spot, but she goes to talk to her mom.
Something's happened. There's been a change, some shift in values. When you no longer understand your people, Mummy, maybe it is time to hand it over to the next generation.
Do you think she ever really considered that?
Nope. Nope.
Maybe it was a fleeting thought, but not anything serious. Probably.
Oh, don't be ridiculous. Remember the vow you took?
And Helen Mirren stops and says with a lot of solemnity,
I declare that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service.
Again, this is really moving to me. How much did she mean this throughout her life?
Which part?
That quote, my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service.
Again, from my limited knowledge of it, not having grown up in England, but studying it from here, I think she very much was committed to that. And it's a great scene in The Crown when she delivered. You see her, Claire Foy, deliver that speech in The Crown. It's a fantastic delivery. And I think she meant every word of it. And the fact that she's still, here and doing it, I think she very much took that job very seriously. And I think one of the reasons why people still revered her and spoke so glowingly about her after she passed was her commitment to it. And they sensed a real commitment to her people and to the country.
That's how I feel too. And I was thinking about the fact that she kept doing it for 25 more years after this.
Right.
I mean, there's certainly a lot of reasons that it might be nice to be a royal. It doesn't seem like a job I'd want, but to have your entire lifetime be a job where you're committed to this kind of a thing. It's funny. There's a moment in the movie Kundun, which is the Scorsese movie about the Dalai Lama, which I think is really underrated, where he's the young kid and they've discovered, okay, you're going to be the Dalai Lama. And one of the, the monks come to him and say, basically, this is what your job is. Your job is simply to love every living thing on earth. That's your job. That's it. And I was thinking about that sounds like a really, really hard job to lay out for the rest of your life. All you have to do is just love every single thing on earth.
Simple enough.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah.
But what if my actions are damaging the crown?
Damaging it? You're the greatest asset this institution has. One of the greatest it has ever had. No. The problem will come when you leave.
So I want to split up the two halves of that line.
What a harbinger.
First half of that line is, man, it's nice to have a mom saying the nice stuff when you need it, And then the second half of the line, I will defer to both of you.
The second part of the line, I think we can't make a judgment on yet because it's still fresh. And Charles, my personal opinion is he should have never been king. He should have passed it on to William and moved on and hung out with his flowers for the rest of his life because that's where he really loves. And I don't think Charles was ever meant to be king. Whether he wanted it or not, only he can say, honestly, how much he wanted it or not. But I don't think he's going to end up being a good king. Because, I just don't think I don't think it's in I don't think it's his thing. And he speaks so much about how he loves the gardening and loves the plants and the flowers and all the stuff that he really just speaks to. And I think that's more his natural thing. So this idea of like, well, we'll see what happens when you die. That's where the problem's going to come. I think that's a harbinger that we could have possibly never known at the time what it was going to lead to. And so now we're going to see, right? So we don't know. The first part of the equation, though, to me, this whole scene mirrors Michael Corleone going to talk to his mother in Godfather Part 2. And I don't mean Elizabeth is Michael Corleone because that's a gangster.
Yeah, it's pretty rough.
But this idea that but what she's dealing with is for the first time ever, she's being seen as a villain. And so going to her mother is very similar to Michael going to his mom, because Michael at that moment, for the first time ever, is seeing that his family is turning. He could give a shit about the entire public or the senator or anything. He didn't care about that. It's that his family is turning on him. And I think Elizabeth, the people who are loyal to him, the people who he cared about, really cares about, are turning on him. And the same thing is happening here. The people that she really cares about are turning on her and calling her a villain and seeing her as a villain. And so there's this sense of losing the public that you care about or the family that you care about and being seen as a villain that I think is correlative to both of those scenes, because they both want to think that they are the good person in the situation. And so they seek the advice and the counsel of the person who birthed them and who could always counsel them as they were growing up when they were questioning things in their lives or when they were unstable in their lives. So that's why both of these scenes have a connective tissue to me in both these movies.
I can't improve on that other than to say that it's an explicit reference to the fact that she's mortal and won't always be there, and therefore it highlights the fact there'll be a break between her and the next person, and in a sense she's wondering if that break's already happened, I suppose.
The other thing I find really interesting about this moment is that in Tony Blair's world there are two other characters. There's Sherry and there's Alistair, both of whom are not just against the monarchy but way against the monarchy, and it's obvious to them that these are, nutters, all the terrible things about this family. Mm-hmm. And the two closest people to the Queen are Prince Philip and her mother. And both of them are the same thing. Obviously, this is what you shouldn't listen to Mr. Blair. This is all ridiculous.
Do you think any of your predecessors would have dropped everything and gone up to London because a bunch of hysterics carrying candles needed help with their grief?
I love, by the way, that the scene ends with her saying,
"As for that silly Mr. Blair with his Cheshire cat grin."
Which, looking at Michael Sheen in particular, not a bad description.
Yeah.
And then we cut to, we don't hear the Queen make the decision. We don't hear her say what she's going to do, but we cut to Philip up on a mountaintop, stalking, listening to a cell phone, yelling in the wind.
That's madness! The whole thing! Bloody madness!
And then the way he throws that cell phone at the dude that's with him, who manages to catch it. It's one of those great, I don't know how many takes they had to do on that. He threw that phone really hard and really fast right at the guy's belly. Anyway, it's just a moment I like.
I love how alien the phone seems to him.
Yeah.
Like he's never seen anything like this before. He doesn't like it. He holds it away from himself and then chucks it the second he can.
Well, you're totally right. And that's that generational thing. We're in a shot on the Queen. And in that shot on her face, we see Charles come in behind, but we don't see him. We just see the tartan of his kilt, which I believe is the Balmoral tartan.
You've decided we're to follow the Prime Minister's advice. I just want to say I admire. I think it's the right decision.
Again, we don't cut to him. My editing instinct would always been, well, I want to see Charles's face. And I think it's so great that we don't. And there's just a very cold look on her face. And then he's been complimentary to his mother where there's been some conflict. And then at the last, and he could just walk out then with the "I admire you" hanging in the room. And instead he says,
"Let's hope we haven't left it too late."
Which is just that little dig at the end. It's like you could have had a moment where maybe you came together a little bit, but no.
That's why I always find his protestations about his mom, subtle or otherwise, such lies, because he just has a natural instinct for that shot.
Someone should write a book of like that's just titled "How to Not Take the Last Shot." You saw it there.
When has it ever worked out?
Yeah, walk away. Unless it's Michael Jordan at the end of that he can take the last shot. But other than that, walk away. We see the gates of Balmoral where there is like a mini version of what we have seen elsewhere. And the gates open and out comes the queen in black with the family, and they go to look at the flowers. And this is the first sort of bending of the royal family to emotionally engaging with what's happened with Diana and what's happened around the world.
It's not right, you know.
No, but further discussion is no longer helpful either.
And I wrote down, man, I wish I had that power. Sometimes it's nice to be the queen and tell your spouse, yeah, we're not going to talk about this anymore.
I suppose it does give the Gillies time to find another stag for the boys. Now theirs has been shot.
What?
And she has a huge reaction. And what we hear is that their stag wandered over some neighbors and a commercial guest got him. She drives over to this other residence and gets out of the car. And I just imagine like what it's like to have the queen get out of a car at your place, you know, where you're working.
Is it his lordship you've come to see?
Oh, no, please don't disturb him. No, I've come on another matter. I hope you don't mind.
And we open this door into a smaller building and we step inside and we see her looking at something for a long time. And there is the stag hanging in the center of the room.
He's a beauty, isn't he? An imperial lamb. 14-pointer.
And the stag that is hanging there is headless. And she walks over to the side, and there's a head, and she touches the spot where the bullet went in.
He was wounded.
Yes.
And what we hear is that their guest got really close and missed his shot, and he wounded him. And this was an investment banker from London. And I just think it's significant that in this stag that's so symbolic, that it was a modern kind of person, a banker, who blew the kill and caused this stag terrible suffering before they could hunt him for miles and then finish him off. And she's deeply moved.
Let's hope he didn't suffer too much. Please pass my congratulations to your guest.
How does she actually feel about the banker who failed to kill the stag?
It's so spot on. It's such a class issue. Because the guy who she's talking to is obviously a worker, technically. But there has always been this distinction in Britain between people who work in service in great houses and people who work in industry.
Yeah.
And you go back 100 years, the people who were the most resistant to social change and the establishment of the welfare state, more so than the aristocracy, were the employees of the aristocracy. And so the queen and the groundskeeper will probably share the contempt for the investment banker that you picked up on. And once again, that's someone coming into their world and intruding of whom they disapprove. I think you're exactly right.
Yeah, there's a symbolism there also because why is he allowed to even come in? Is this a matter of they have to take these reservations to make money, to keep these things going? So this idea of selling out a piece of the monarchy to the modernists to kind of see what it can, so you see what it can lead to, this idea. And also if you look at through the Diana prism, she died in a foreign country, outside away from her people.
Oh.
And so there is that kind of thing. If you go with the stag being Diana, being killed by someone from the outside of her world, you know, these paparazzis and whatever, and the driver that was fucked up and all of that. So so there's more to it, obviously, in this whole situation. And the driver who was fucked with by the paparazzi and all that, like, just it all just leads to, these are people outside of Diana's circle. And, you know, sometimes when I think about this moment, I think about her death, I think about, like, what would have happened if she had not broken away from Charles, just kind of, or broken away and had that kind of like arranged situation. She would do her thing, Charles would do his thing, and stayed where she was. Would she not have died? Would she have lived a long life? Would she have been there to raise her children? So this whole thing of her stroking the head of the stag is, you can even see it as what could have been versus what happened. A moment of reflection.
It's funny because what I see, particularly in the moment of, to congratulate the guy that killed the stag, is that in my mind she loved this stag. She found some connection with it. She is definitely didn't want this stag to get killed, as we saw when she shoot him away when the hunters are coming before. And so this guy not only killed the thing that she loved, but failed to do it in a way that would make it happen without suffering. And this beautiful animal suffered a whole bunch the way that she's been suffering. Yeah. And what she's been claiming is that we should deal with our grief privately and with dignity. And so rather than expressing anger or remorse or sadness, she does the thing that she's supposed to do, which is to compliment the guy and to say congratulations, because that's what you do. Right. And that is what she's done throughout the entire time that she's queen. I do what I am supposed to do. Right. There's it's like this sacrificing your own personal emotions for the greater good.
Yeah.
Whether that's a good thing or bad.
Lip service, as you said.
Lip service, yeah. And she's in a plane and we're landing soon and she gets given the speech. And this is the unknowable quality of her. She's going to do this thing that's really, really painful. And we're not going to get let into how she's feeling, really. And we are in this POV shot in a car driving through these crowds as the queen is looking for the first time at the crowds that have gathered. Alistair rewrites or makes an adjustment to the speech.
To make it sound like it came from a human being.
Yeah, all right.
Well, at least the old bat's finally agreed to visit Diana's coffin.
When you get it wrong, you really get it wrong.
And everyone turns because they haven't seen him lose it like this.
That woman has given her whole life in service to her people. 50 years doing a job she never wanted. A job she watched kill her father. She's executed it with honor, dignity, and, as far as I can tell, without a single blemish, and now we're all baying for her blood. All because she's struggling to lead the world in mourning for someone who threw everything she offered back in her face, and who for the last few years seemed committed 24/7 to destroying everything she holds most dear.
I love this scene.
Why?
Well, partly because I agree with what he said, I suppose. Partly because up until that point, he's been so awkward in his attempts to convey himself, because he had to be. Partly because I loathe Alistair Campbell, who was actually a terrible person in real life. I think it humanized the character as well and showed that it was getting to him. Because he the Cheshire Cat smile was a real criticism that was made of him, and he was accused of being glib and presidential, which is an insult in the UK. And there he is losing his temper, and in a way that was probably accurate, probably does convey what he thought.
Yeah.
I enjoyed that moment.
For me, it points at this thing that we're suffering from, I think, even more today, which is the need to cast the people we disagree with as evil enemies and do everything in our power to destroy them, rather than seeing that, there are evil people in the world, and some of us might even agree who some of them are, but the vast majority of people are people and have human lives and human stuff and are doing the best they can in the way they can with the information that they have, which might be faulty. And casting people as villains, black and white villains, is just not that useful a lot of the time.
I also think this is a great moment in the movie where he, in a way, speaks for the people that were probably watching this movie that didn't like Diana and that were frustrated. Although Charles is the imperfect messenger to deliver that message, were frustrated by how many people were swayed or brainwashed or deluded or influenced to believe the narrative about Diana, because Diana had a very powerful PR team. Very powerful. And so this moment where he says, this is a woman who was committed to destroying the thing that she loved and believed in 24/7. There are a lot of people who feel that way about Diana, that she was insulting the monarchy, that she threatened the monarchy, she was trying to destroy the monarchy, in essence, destroy Britain. This idea there. So Tony kind of speaks for that, which is and the moment and the thing that it's the Labour Party person kind of defending the monarchy against Diana is kind of an interesting juxtaposition as well when you're watching it happen. And so, I think the scene carries a lot of weight for that reason as well.
Of course, it also makes Tony Blair look a little two-faced, because on the one hand, he's saying the people's princess and playing the whole game. And then on the other hand, privately, he's saying, oh, she ruined everything. He's trying to bring down the monarchy.
Looking presidential, as you said.
And then Queen Elizabeth gets out of the car. And her walking through this crowd that's in silence, it's all in silence, and seeing the signs that say, of course, we love you, Diana, but then sign that says, they don't deserve you. And another sign that says, they have your blood on their hands.
Mm-hmm.
And to have to walk through this, I mean, talk about a challenge to the, I'm going to do everything for this country. I'm solemnly going to, in dignity and all these values that she has. And now it's like she has to see all this and then not let it visually affect her. And she sees this little girl, sees her with flowers, and says,
Would you like me to place those for you?
and the girl says,
No.
and the reaction because the first reaction is that she goes, oh, this little girl hates me because she thinks I killed Diana. That's what's happening. And then there's a pause, and the girl says,
These are for you.
And I burst into tears. It's such a good moment.
That's the most stressful moment in the whole movie.
Yeah. What were you thinking? Because I think you hadn't seen this in a while. When you saw it the first time and she said no, what was your reaction?
Oh, I was just horrified.
Yeah.
I thought, my goodness, that is savage. And I'd forgotten that it resolves in that way. And then when it does, I felt extremely relieved. And it is an emotional moment.
For me, I kind of go, how did this little girl know to bring flowers to this place when no one had no idea that the queen was going to show up? I don't think they could have been for her. And I also wrote down, man, Helen Mirren is amazing. Because her just saying thank you and then looking at this crowd that starts to curtsy for her. Wow.
Yeah.
I wish I didn't look at the actual footage because I know this happened. I'm sure there's footage of it.
Yeah, there is.
But I haven't looked at it. Did people actually curtsy?
Oh, yeah. Oh, sure. People were bowing to Charles when he got out of the car recently when he was going to the castle. I can't remember what castle. I think Balmoral, Windsor, whichever one was going to. There were people outside, and he got out of the car, kind of mirroring a little bit of what Elizabeth did for Diana, and was shaking people's hands, and people were bowing and curtsying and whatever. So, yeah, she's,
The thing I wrote down here is I think this scene is so much more important to the structure of the film and the emotional journey of the film than the TV address.
Right.
Like this to me is the emotional turn of the film. And speaking of which, she's getting ready for the TV address. They give her the last minute addition that Alistair Campbell wrote, which is to add the lines as a grandmother.
So what I say to you now as your queen and as a grandmother, I say from my heart.
You think you can say it?
Do I have a choice?
We're ready for you, Your Majesty.
By the way, they really did set this up so that they raised her on a platform. So looking through the window, you could see the crowds behind her. And the idea was to show her connection to the British people rather than a disconnect from the British people, which I think is smart.
She's being handled, though. It's such a great scene to see that. Like her disdain that they would improve upon her speech. There's that sense of it all. And I feel for her in that moment, to be honest with you. You're a new government coming and telling me what the fuck to say. Like, it just like, you can sense the bristling that's there in that line when she says, do I have a choice?
It's funny. So I watched the original speech with Queen Elizabeth and then watched them both kind of twice back to back. What's so interesting is the difference between reality and acting is that in the speech done by Helen Mirren, you see the control, but you also see the layers under the control. You see the thoughts, which is what great actors do. You see the emotions going through as she says this and her restraint, her perfect restraint of the emotions, but they're still there. For me, watching the actual Queen Elizabeth deliver the same speech, you see none of that. She is perfectly controlled.
It is not easy to express a sense of loss, since the initial shock is often succeeded by a mixture of other feelings, disbelief, incomprehension, anger, and concern for those who remain. We have all felt those emotions in these last few days.
How powerful do you think it is at this moment for the Queen to admit that she has felt these emotions?
Certainly, because she's trying to connect with the people and what they were experiencing. So she's finally coming around, whether it's true or not. She's finally coming around to this thing that she's been being told since the beginning of the movie, that people are finding themselves unusually moved by Diana's death, and so she's trying to speak for them by saying she also felt these feelings.
Yeah, so I agree that that's what people wanted. I think that it's intrusive and almost totalitarian to demand that somebody express or feel or represent the emotions you have. And this is one reason I just dislike the hysteria. It's beautifully done in the movie, but there's just no way that the Queen would ever have said that unless she were forced to do so. And as a constitutional matter with small c, I find it odd that the British public demanded it of the monarchy when they had Tony Blair, who was making speeches and emoting and saying people's princess. But they did. That is what they wanted. And she dutifully, eventually, did it. But I find it awkward watching it.
I was going to say, Charlie, do you think it was very American of them? Like, I was asking.
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Look, I'm second to none in my love of this country, but it's a different country than Britain. And
we're much more emotional as a country.
Yeah.
I've got 17 different thoughts in my brain. The first one is I can remember, I think, the first moments that I saw politicians cry. And it's because it's like, George W. Bush at 9/11, Obama after Sandy Hook, like there's some moments because you didn't see that. I know you never saw Richard Nixon cry or LBJ or like that just was, they were not supposed to experience those emotions.
You're right.
I think we've come to this place where we do demand some emotional connection. And I, as a relative, even though I've said multiple times how I burst into tears watching this movie, I'm generally not a terribly emotional guy. And so like, and there have been people who have been upset by my lack of emotional reaction to various things. And so I'm kind of with Charlie. If like someone said, okay, Steve, you got to get up there and express some emotion, when I didn't necessarily feel it, that would be your word totalitarian. Ain't that far wrong.
It's the didn't necessarily feel it bit that I think is so pernicious.
Yeah.
I'm not devoid of emotion. I just don't want to be forced to feel or demonstrate other people's.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes we are called upon in relationships and stuff to be present emotionally for people going through a strong emotion that we may or may not feel to the same degree.
Right.
But that's not the same as forcing me to pretend to feel it.
Well, that's why I think the scene is so important, because this is where the Queen becomes a politician, which is something she was never, tasked with being. Yes, it is her job to be political in negotiations with other countries' leaders in certain situations. Yes, of course. But with her own public, no. And I think that's where the divide starts to happen a little bit. And we see that the public itself, just as the entire globe was kind of changing in their approach to these things, and like you said, like you both said, like, in times past, you rarely saw that. Like Walter Cronkite choking up over the JFK assassination, that was massive. Like that didn't happen. News anchors did not get emotional over anybody dying, and they'd literally report people's deaths every day. But the president and President Kennedy, there was just something about that had that reaction. And also, I think this mirrors that we as a society were in the 90s starting to open the door more and more to the idea of talking about our emotions, of expressing our emotions, because of psychology and therapy and all of that started in the 50s and 60s to start to take hold and then really pass through generations to become more and more of a thing that people focused on. So there was this demand, as you guys say, for our political leaders to show the emotion. And when you don't, nowadays, if you don't show emotion for these kinds of things, you are absolutely raked over the coals, at least in our country, raked over the coals for it. So it's gone past demand to where there's expectation. And if that expectation isn't met, it can be colossal for you. And I think that's I think what we're seeing, the beginnings of that affecting even someone as removed as Queen Elizabeth.
I just had this image of an advisor going up and, Alexander Hamilton going up and saying, listen, President Washington, we really need you to tear up Because you're talking about the Whiskey Rebellion or whatever.
Yeah.
You know.
It wouldn't happen. Then again, those men were pretty terrible to certain people. So,
sure. Sorry, that my brain went off on a totally different tangent.
So what I say to you now, as your queen and as a grandmother, I say from my heart.
And we cut to Cherie and Tony.
Heart. And what heart? Doesn't mean a word of this.
That's not the point. What she's doing is extraordinary.
And it's really, that's everything we've just been talking about. It is I don't know if it's extraordinary good, but it's an extraordinary change.
Yeah, and I wonder if what Charlie just said, if you bristled at him delivering that line, that it's not extraordinary, it's actually imprisoning her in a reaction that she actually isn't genuinely feeling.
I would say for me, extraordinary is non-pejorative, is something, it doesn't necessarily mean it's good.
Okay.
It's outside of the ordinary, and that it definitely is.
Now you've gone weak at the knees. I don't know why I'm so surprised. At the end of the day, all Labour Prime Ministers go gaga for the Queen.
And that was true even in a period when the Labour Party was explicitly socialist.
Yeah.
It wasn't necessarily true of the Labour Party, but it was true of the Prime Minister. And although Blair came in as a modernizer, he just didn't come in promising to abolish or reform the monarchy because the monarchy was popular. And in fact, the monarchy is extremely popular in many constituencies that Labour always wins.
Ironically, yeah.
Yeah, so, I'm not sure how much of a betrayal that part of Tony Blair's legacy was to those who had the hopes that you just shared. Certainly, he betrayed those who thought he was going to be different than he was with his economic policy and essentially entrenched Thatcher's legacy. And of course, the Iraq War was his undoing. But I don't think many of the people who voted for Tony Blair had the monarchy in their mind when they did so.
May those who died rest in peace. And may we, each and every one of us, thank God for someone who made many, many people happy.
And it's like, what's funny is, didn't make her life. She didn't say she made my life happy. And I would say Helen Mirren's face just at the end of the speech is amazing. So much there. And now we're heading towards the funeral, and we have a high angle of Diana's coffin. It reminded me, John, we just did Gandhi's funeral in Gandhi. And it reminded me of that, just the sheer scale of this. Not that I would compare, Princess Diana to Gandhi in any way. As we're entering into the Abbey, we see Elton John and Steven Spielberg and Tom Cruise and Tom Hanks. And then we cut, I think, by the way, throughout this whole film, they do a beautiful job of intercutting real footage with faked news footage of our fake royals. And they do so here.
Diana was the very essence of compassion, of duty, of style, of beauty. A very British girl who transcended nationality.
By the way, every time they cut to Prince Philip, I think it's hilarious with his sort of dour face.
Above all, we give thanks for the life of a woman I'm so proud to be able to call my sister. The unique, the complex, the extraordinary and irreplaceable Diana, whose beauty, both internal and external, will never be extinguished from our minds.
It's a really good speech, as eulogies go. And what we see as this is happening is the huge, massive crowds watching this on big screens outside of the funeral. And then, you've probably had this moment. There's been so many times I've been in a memorial service, including one quite recently, where someone makes a beautiful eulogy and you have the urge to applaud. And you go like, wait, am I supposed to applaud now? Like, what's supposed to happen? And sometimes there has been applause and sometimes there hasn't. And in this case, I think they handled it so well because there's no applause inside the church. They're all sitting quietly. But outside, the people watching it on TV burst into applause, and that forces the people inside the church to start clapping. The Queen does not applaud. And then we cut to 2 months later, and Tony is getting ready, and Sherry says,
I hope she shows you some respect this time. It's quite a debt of gratitude she owes you, Mr. Saviour of the monarchy.
In the construction of this movie, I don't think this events were good for their marriage. I don't know if what the reality is. We're back where we started this film, which is him going to meet the Queen. He goes in. She kind of dodges him when he goes to kiss her hand. And she is so cold at the beginning of the scene. And I'm going to say something odd, which is I really love this movie. I love the first half of the scene. I actually don't love where this goes as we go. I love with her being totally cold to him. And he's trying to make small talk about, these diplomatic things that she's done recently. And apparently this is a thing that the Queen did, was when she wanted to put you on the spot, she would not answer questions. She would just give you the silent treatment and force you to ramble. Which, as I told you, John, that was a Hoover technique. This is Doc. He would just he'd ask you a question and then you'd answer, and then he'd stare at you and you'd just start talking because you couldn't handle being just stared at in silence.
Also, we haven't had a chance to speak since that week. And I wanted to offer my apologies.
Whatever for?
In case you felt manhandled or managed in any way.
No, not at all.
I love the coldness. I love watching her make Tony squirm.
Yeah.
It's when she starts revealing the emotion that she's withheld throughout the entire film that I don't actually totally buy this.
Okay.
For me.
I don't think I shall ever understand what happened this summer.
Well, the circumstances were exceptional, ma'am. And in the end, you showed great personal strength, courage, and humility.
You're confusing humility with humiliation.
It's a great line. I just don't know if she'd say that to him. This whole movie, she's not revealed how she feels or any weaknesses or frailties.
Well, she snapped at him.
Yeah.
And so there is a feeling that she chooses when she's honest with him and when she, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, I guess that's what I'm trying to say, because obviously she's been honest with him in communications, but I think she's chooses where she lets him in and where she doesn't. And certainly that moment when she snapped at him earlier in the film. And then this moment, I think she's in a way kind of putting him back in his place and getting him to understand where the power lies in the situation. So I love that.
That's not true.
You didn't read the cards on the flowers outside the palace that Friday.
I actually think history will show it was a good week for you.
Which I think it will. I mean, I think that's what this movie is.
You're more respected now than ever.
I gather some of your closest advisors were less fulsome in their support.
One or two. But as a leader, I could never have added my voice to that chorus.
Because you saw those headlines and you thought one day that might happen to me. And it will, Mr. Blair. Quite suddenly and without warning.
I feel like this is from the movie that was written in 2005. I feel like this is specifically pointing out the Iraq War and what happened.
Oh, interesting.
That's how I feel about this moment, which is why I don't like it as much.
Okay.
I feel like this is the writer and the director giving their political commentary rather than the Queen.
Oh, I do love this time of day. Shall we walk while there's still light? You know, the clocks go back next week. It'll be dark before 5.
And this is true, that she was a serious walker.
I do hope you're a walker.
I am.
Good. I always think these meetings have a far greater chance of success if the Prime Minister is a walker.
And they head out, and then as they're walking, she stops and says,
1 in 4, you said, wanted to get rid of me.
For about half an hour.
And she says, and again, this is where I don't believe that she would say this to him.
I've never been hated like that before.
I mean, she's just kept all of her emotions inside for the whole film.
Mm-hmm.
And she hasn't shared this with Prince Philip. She didn't say any vulnerability with her mom. Like the fact that she's saying this to Tony Blair. And they're great actors, and it's well written, and it's beautifully shot. But it's I wish it wasn't in the film.
Wow. Really?
Yeah.
You feel that strongly about
it? It just lessens the film a little bit to me.
Fair enough. Well, I think she was vulnerable with her mom. Do you like?
Yeah, a little bit.
I should hand over the monarchy. That's as vulnerable as you can
You're
get.
right. Yeah, you're right.
And so, but I think this, in a way, is a weird power move, and then at the same time, a way of finding common ground for them to talk.
Yeah,
she makes it clear that he manhandled her, and she does say, "Oh no, I didn't feel this way." And then the humiliation one is the one that really kind of nails it. for him. And then when she says the 1 in 4 thing, that's her taking him into her confidence.
Yeah.
And I imagine that that's a tactic as a queen to get the. I mean, as Charlie pointed out, what Sherry says to him, that all the labor prime minister falls in love with the queen, and it may be because the queen uses that tactic or has used that tactic to bring them into her, using a little bit of the vulnerability to bring them into the circle, so to speak. And because Labor people are a little softer at heart. Now, I'm going to get in trouble for that, but I'm saying that that's what I think. Just like I think on our side is a little bit softer, so they're more willing to give in to that kind of vulnerability and find a sense of connection with the queen in that way. And so I'm not saying she does it in a evil, manipulative way. I think it's a way of maintaining a better relationship with that prime minister to allow them to come in just a little bit into the circle of her confidence. So. But if it doesn't work for you, it doesn't work for you. That's how I took it.
I found the beginning and the end overly didactic, so I share your criticism of the end. But I also found the opening scene a little didactic with the painter.
Yeah, I can see that.
So it's bookended by didactic scenes, and then in the middle, it's a great movie.
Nowadays, people want glamour and tears, the grand performance. I'm not very good at that. I never have been. I prefer to keep my feelings to myself. And foolishly, I believed that was what the people wanted from their queen, not to make a fuss nor wear one's heart on one's sleeve. Duty first, self second. That's how I was brought up. That's all I've ever known.
Yeah, this is where I go, like, I think it's a great line, but I already got that, Like, I understood that because I just watched the movie. And she said, but I do love this moment.
You were so young when you became queen.
And there's a pause and a thought.
Yes. Yes, a girl.
That's a nice moment.
But I can see that the world has changed. And one must modernize.
And I love this moment because I love watching her put him back in his place.
Well, perhaps that's where I can help.
Oh, no. Don't get ahead of yourself, Prime Minister. Remember, I am the one supposed to be advising you.
And she walks off fast, and there is her private secretary, and there is a clear look between them where I think he is going, do you want me to interrupt so you can get out of this meeting? Like he did at the very beginning of the movie. And she doesn't, and they walk off talking. And that, of course, is the end of The Queen. It premiered at the Venice Film Festival, where it received a 5-minute standing ovation. It made $56 million on a budget of $15 million, which is pretty good. It was nominated for Best Picture, Director, Screenplay, Costumes, and Score. The costume went to Marie Antoinette. Directing went to Scorsese for The Departed. Music went to Babel. Picture went to The Departed. That was also the year of Little Miss Sunshine, Letters to Iwo Jima, and Babel, which is an odd Oscar year.
Yes.
It lost screenplay to Little Miss Sunshine, which it shouldn't have.
Less said about that movie, the better.
It's fine. And Helen Mirren was up against Penelope Cruz for Voyeur, Judi Dench for Notes on a Scandal, Meryl Streep for The Devil Wears Prada, which is certainly a beloved performance, and Kate Winslet in Little Children.
Also.
Helen Mirren not only wins, but she is, my understanding, is the only lead actress to ever sweep all 4 Big Critics Awards, which is LA National Board of Review, New York, and National Society of Film Critics, and sweep all the big awards, Oscar, Golden Globe, British Academy Award, and the SAG Award, and the Critics' Choice Award. And look, Meryl Streep is great in Devil Wears Prada. She doesn't make me cry like this one does. And many, many people think that this movie is a critical turn in people's feelings about the monarchy, and also is very specifically about Tony Blair post the Iraq War. He was in office when the movie came out, and by 2007, he's out of office. So that is The Queen. John, what are your final thoughts?
I think this is such a fantastic film that still holds up. And so many of those films from right around that time don't always hold up. You said Babel, and Little Miss Sunshine. And so for me, this film does. This film still speaks powerfully. If you have any kind of feelings about the monarchy, and even if you don't, if you strip away all the titles, you're looking at an older woman confronting a newer generation and how to navigate that. And there are complications surrounding how she does that. And I think there's universal themes, universal interactions, universal conversations that go on. And at times you can forget that she's a queen, and this whole thing. It's just a mother with her husband and her son and her daughter-in-law, who is no longer a daughter-in-law, navigating all of that, and this young whippersnapper of a guy trying to tell her how to do things. And so all of that, it still works at its base core level. And then when you throw in everything that it actually is about, I think it holds up even more so, and has more meaning in 2022, I gather, after the death of Queen Elizabeth than it has had before. So I think that speaks powerfully to the enduring legacy of the film.
Charlie, what do you think?
I think it's terrific. I was surprised how enjoyable I found it a second time as a Brit. I think I saw it when it came out, and I saw it 3 weeks ago. That's quite a lot of time to pass. That's a lot of politics to pass. And the Queen had died in the interim. And it was just fantastic. It's aided enormously by the sheer quality of the acting, especially the two main characters. It's not annoying to watch as somebody who is from Britain originally. Sometimes productions can be. It's funny because when I was comparing it, that period of time on the first episode, I mentioned 9/11, and I think the fact that 9/11 happened afterwards has swept the Diana death out of my mind. It's not something I think about. I go back, and if I think big things that happened in the world, I sort of stop at 9/11 because it was bigger. But it was a salutary reminder of just how remarkable that moment was, and how dominant it was, and how much effect it had on every institution of the country I grew up in. So this movie does a really fantastic job of capturing that and taking you behind the scenes, even if a lot of it's fictionalized.
I think for me, what's interesting about this movie is, of course, it's a story about this sensational event and this huge emotional reaction from this public and the monarchy and all of those things. But some of the other things that are interesting that are things that I actually see more today than I would have seen them. And one of them is the relationship between the media and reality, and the way the media constructs a reality, and then we have to deal with the reality. It's also a movie that is generational, about the World War II generation and more modern generations, and how that relates to how we express emotions and what is required in terms of, expressing emotions within a family, and then how that is transformed in terms of what the public requires in terms of our emotional life, and how we deal with those things, and how we deal with a sense of duty. Like if you were to talk to my dad was all about duty and doing. He totally would fit in with the Queen. Not really, because he was a short, balding Jewish optometrist from San Francisco. So in that sense, maybe it didn't work so well. But in the sense of just like, this is what you're supposed to do, and that's how you do it. That's how my dad looked at the world. And we're not in that world anymore. And so navigating what are we supposed to do, and how are we supposed to behave, I think has become much tougher. And so while I think the Queen was out of touch and disconnected from what was necessary in the moments, I think we've lost something, I think there's something that has gone away that was really valuable to have. And that was a sense of, as you said at the very beginning, Charlie, a sense of continuity, and a sense of what was right, and a sense of just, this is how you're supposed to behave. And I don't think we have that as much anymore. So that's what we think about the Queen. Of course, we'd love to hear what you think. You can visit us on our Facebook page, do a search for the Cine-Files. You can follow us on Twitter at Cine_Files, at Instagram at Cine-Files Podcast. You can subscribe to the show at all the subscribey places like Apple Podcasts and YouTube and Spotify and Stitcher. And if you happen to be on Apple Podcasts, you should leave a review. And you also happen to be on Apple Podcasts, maybe check out the Charles CW Cooke podcast and the National Review Editors podcast, both of which I listen to. And if you want to support the show, you can do it at patreon.com/the Cine-Files. You can buy or stream The Queen along with any other movie we've ever reviewed on Cine-Files.net. And if you want to reach me, you can do it at SR Morris on Twitter, SR Morris1 on Instagram, and Enterprise Incidents to go big time Star Trek. John, how would people find you?
You can always find me at The Roca Says on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, The Outlaw Nation on Twitch. my YouTube channel, youtube.com/John Roca Says. It's called The Outlaw Nation. And then my other podcasts as well, the Geek Buddies, the Top 10, and the Hot Mic. They're out there for you all to listen to.
Seems like you've been making some scoops on the Hot Mic lately.
Yeah, I had a big one that could have dropped on Monday, but I was sworn to secrecy by the producer, and I could not drop it. So I'm discovering how can I say this? The line you have to walk when you're trying to establish yourself as someone who's a little bit more of an insider here in Hollywood. So,
and Charlie, if people wanted to find you, contact you, follow you, how would they do that?
You can find me on Twitter at Charles CW Cooke, or if you go to my website, which is charlescwcooke.com, then there's a contact form where you can sign up for my newsletter, or you can click through to the podcast, and everything else I do is linked from there.
And I had to say, we've had just hit 300 podcasts on the Cine-Files, and this conversation has been one of my absolute favorites. And I really, really, it's been so great having you on the show. It's so great hearing your expertise. It's really been a true pleasure.
Yeah, thank you, John.
No, it's been fantastic. Thank you for inviting me.
You are very, very welcome. And I think that's it for this week. We will see you next time for another great film on the Cine-Files.